The weight of command. The frozen air cut through Murphy's lungs as he studied the abandoned M36 tank destroyer through his field glasses. Smoke still curled from its damaged turret, a black smudge against the white canvas of the Vosges Mountains. The morning assault on Holzwihr had stalled 3 hours ago when Company B walked into that carefully prepared killing field, and now the German defensive line stretched across the valley like a steel trap waiting to snap shut. Behind him, Sergeant Kowalski spat tobacco juice into the snow and muttered something about farm boys playing soldier. The other men hunched deeper into their foxholes, eyes fixed on that tree line where muzzle flashes had been winking like deadly fireflies all morning. 26 men from 2 squads lay pinned in a drainage ditch 300 yards ahead, close enough to hear their calls for help, too far to reach without crossing open ground that German machine gunners had already zeroed. Murphy lowered the binoculars and felt the weight of his new lieutenant's bars. 3 days ago, he'd been just another rifleman with too many close calls and a reputation for being where the shooting was thickest. Now Captain Morrison was dead. First Sergeant Hayes was bleeding out in an aid station, and 43 men were looking to a 20-year-old sharecropper's son to keep them alive in the frozen hell of eastern France. The radio crackled with static and urgent voices. Battalion wanted to know why the advance had stalled. Regimental headquarters was asking about casualty reports. Higher command was pushing for results that looked good on situation maps back at division. None of them were looking at Kowalski's raw hands shaking as he tried to load frozen rounds into his rifle, or hearing the way young Jenkins kept whispering his mother's name like a prayer. Murphy keyed the radio handset, his Texas drawl cutting through the military chatter like honey poured over barbed wire. His voice carried that same unhurried cadence he'd used to call cattle across the cotton fields back home, but now it carried the lives of men who'd stopped believing in miracles. The burning tank destroyer sat between the American positions and the German line like a monument to good intentions gone wrong. Its crew had tried to provide fire support for the morning attack, but a well-placed Panzerfaust had turned their armor into a death trap. Murphy had watched 3 men burn, boys from Michigan who'd shared their chocolate with him just yesterday. Now that same burning hull might be the key to everything. From its position, a man could see the German strongpoints that remained invisible from the American side. More importantly, he could direct artillery fire with the kind of precision that turned hopeless situations into footnotes in after-action reports. The problem was getting there alive and staying there long enough to matter. Murphy studied the distance again, calculating sight lines and fields of fire the way his father had taught him to read deer trails through East Texas brush. The Germans expected the Americans to either charge straight ahead like movie heroes or pull back like sensible soldiers. They weren't prepared for something different, something that violated every tactical principle Murphy had learned but honored something deeper than doctrine. He handed the radio to Kowalski and checked his carbine one more time. The metal felt cold enough to burn skin, but it was the only honest weight in a morning full of impossible choices. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The German artillery had fallen silent 20 minutes ago, leaving behind the kind of quiet that made every heartbeat sound like thunder. Murphy knew that silence. It meant the enemy was preparing something worse than random harassment fire. Somewhere across that snow-covered field, Wehrmacht observers were calling in coordinates for a final barrage that would finish what the morning's failed assault had started. Corporal Jackson crawled up from the right flank, his face grey with more than cold. He'd been with the company since Sicily, long enough to recognize the look in Murphy's eyes that meant someone was about to do something that would either save them all or get them killed trying. "Sir, what's the plan?" Jackson's voice carried the careful respect that combat veterans gave to officers who'd proved themselves, but Murphy could hear the doubt underneath. Everyone knew the book answer: call for smoke, pull back the pinned squads under covering fire, and establish a new defensive line. Everyone also knew that by the time Battalion approved the artillery request and coordinated the withdrawal, those 26 men would be dead or captured. Murphy pointed toward the burning tank destroyer with the tip of his carbine. The smoke was thicker now, black columns rising straight up in the still air like funeral pyres. That M36's got the best view of their positions. Someone gets up there with a radio. We can walk artillery right onto their machine gun nests. Jackson followed his gaze and went very still. The distance wasn't impossible, maybe 60 yards of open ground, but every inch would be under direct observation from the German tree line. A man might make it halfway before the riflemen found their range. And even if he reached the tank destroyer alive, staying there would be like painting a target on his chest. "Who's got that kind of luck?" Jackson asked, though his expression said he already knew the answer. Murphy was already moving, checking his ammunition, and adjusting his helmet strap with the methodical care he'd learned from too many close calls in the mountains of eastern France. The other men watched him prepare with a mixture of admiration and horror, recognizing the ritual that preceded Murphy's most dangerous moments. Kowalski grabbed his arm as he prepared to leave the foxhole. "Kid, this ain't like the other times. There's no cover out there, no angle that gives you an edge. This is suicide." For a moment, Murphy felt the full weight of every man's eyes on him. They'd followed him through the bloody advance up the Vosges slopes, trusted his instincts when official orders made no sense, and watched him walk away from situations that should have killed him. But this felt different. This felt like the kind of decision that separated living soldiers from names carved on memorial walls. He thought about those voices calling for help from the drainage ditch, voices that would go silent if he waited for someone else to find a solution. He thought about the reports that would flow back to battalion, reducing 26 men to statistics and tactical lessons learned. Most of all, he thought about going home to Texas with the knowledge that he'd chosen his own life over theirs when it mattered most. Murphy keyed the radio one more time, his drawl cutting through the static with instructions that sounded more like suggestions than orders. "All units, hold position. Do not advance on my signal. Wait for the artillery to do its work." He climbed out of the foxhole and began walking toward the burning tank destroyer, not running or crawling, just walking across the snow with the same steady pace he'd used to cross cotton fields on quiet Sunday mornings. Behind him, he heard Kowalski's voice rise in something between prayer and profanity, but the words faded beneath the roar of his own heartbeat. German bullets began snapping through the air around Murphy when he was 30 yards from the burning M36. The sound was sharp and intimate, not the distant crack of random fire, but the purposeful whistle of rounds aimed specifically at him. Snow kicked up in small geysers where the bullets struck, creating a constellation of near misses that mapped his progress across the killing field. He didn't flinch or change pace, though every instinct screamed at him to dive for cover that didn't exist. Instead, he kept walking with that same unhurried gait, carrying the radio handset like a farmer might carry a bucket of feed. Behind him, the voices of his men had gone silent. Even Kowalski had stopped cursing long enough to watch this impossible walk through enemy crosshairs. The tank destroyer loomed larger as Murphy approached, its damaged turret now clearly visible through the smoke. The Panzerfaust had punched through the front armor and detonated inside, killing the crew instantly but leaving the external machine gun mount intact. More importantly, the burning engine was producing enough smoke to provide concealment for what Murphy needed to do. From his position in the command foxhole, Captain Williams of the adjacent company watched through his own binoculars with growing disbelief. He'd heard stories about the young lieutenant from Texas, everyone in the 3rd Infantry Division had, but seeing Murphy cross that open ground under direct fire was like witnessing something that belonged in official histories, not real battlefield moments. Williams keyed his own radio, reporting the situation to battalion with the careful language of a man who wasn't entirely sure he believed what he was seeing. "Able 6, this is Baker 6. We have one officer advancing on foot toward the destroyed vehicle. Request immediate artillery support for observed fire mission. The response came back with typical headquarters efficiency. Artillery would be available in 15 minutes, pending clearance from Regimental Fire Direction Center. Williams looked at his watch and knew that Murphy would either succeed or die long before the first shells arrived through proper channels. Meanwhile, in the drainage ditch, Private Foster pressed his face against the frozen mud and listened to the German bullets searching for their target. He'd been pinned here since the morning assault collapsed, watching good men bleed out because the enemy had perfect fields of fire across their position. When word came down that Lieutenant Murphy was making some kind of solo attack, Foster had assumed it was gallows humor, the kind of impossible story that spread through foxholes when the situation looked hopeless. Now he could actually see Murphy walking through the gunfire like it was a spring rain, carrying that radio handset and moving toward the burning tank with supernatural calm. Foster found himself holding his breath, not from fear of the bullets snapping overhead, but from something like awe at watching ordinary courage transform into legend. Murphy reached the M36 and hauled himself onto its deck, the metal still hot from the fire, but providing the elevated position he needed. From here, he could see the entire German defensive line, machine gun nests that had been invisible from ground level, mortar positions tucked into the tree line, and the communication trenches that connected their strongpoints into an integrated killing system. He raised the radio handset and began calling out target coordinates in that same steady drawl, his voice never rising or quickening despite the rifle rounds that sparked off the tank destroyer's armor. For the first time since the assault stalled, the men of Company B began to believe that someone might actually pull them out of this mess. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The first artillery rounds arrived 8 minutes after Murphy reached the tank destroyer, not through official channels, but because a forward observer from Charlie Company had been monitoring the radio traffic and recognized the sound of someone calling fire missions with deadly precision. The shells screamed overhead and detonated exactly where Murphy had directed them, turning the leftmost German machine gun position into smoking crater. Murphy adjusted his position on the burning deck and called out new coordinates, his Texas drawl now the most important voice on the radio net. Fire mission, grid 247361. Machine gun position, infantry in the open, 2 rounds, high explosive. The artillery responded immediately, and the second German strongpoint vanished in a cloud of debris and silence. From the drainage ditch, Private Foster watched the systematic destruction of the positions that had held them pinned for 3 hours. Each of Murphy's fire missions was surgical in its precision, close enough to shatter the German defenses, far enough from the trapped squads to keep them safe. Foster had seen artillery work before, but never directed by someone who could actually see what he was shooting at. The German riflemen began concentrating their fire on the tank destroyer, recognizing that the young American officer had turned their prepared defensive line into a death trap. Bullets rang against the M36's armor like deadly hail, but Murphy continued calling coordinates with the same methodical calm he'd shown walking across the open ground. His voice never wavered, even as rifle rounds sparked inches from his position. Captain Williams, monitoring the action from his command post, found himself revising everything he thought he knew about battlefield leadership. The textbook solution to Company B's problem involved complex coordination between multiple units, smoke screens, and carefully planned withdrawal routes. Murphy had solved it by walking into enemy fire with a radio and refusing to die when any reasonable person would have been cut down. Sergeant Kowalski, still crouched in the foxhole where Murphy had left him, was quietly coming to terms with the fact that he'd just watched his commanding officer do something that would be talked about in American Legion halls for decades. The farm boy with the apologetic manner had systematically dismantled a prepared German defensive position while standing on a burning tank in full view of enemy riflemen. But Murphy wasn't finished. As the artillery silenced the machine gun nests, German infantry began moving through the communication trenches, trying to establish new firing positions that could cover the retreat of their surviving forces. Murphy spotted the movement and began calling for walking barrage, artillery fire that would move systematically through the tree line, driving the enemy away from positions where they could threaten the trapped American squads. The radio in his hand felt heavier with each transmission, weighted not by its physical mass, but by the knowledge that every correction, every adjustment of coordinates was measured in American lives saved or lost. This wasn't the kind of decision they taught in officer training. This was something deeper and more personal, the kind of choice that left permanent marks on a man's soul. 20 minutes after Murphy had reached the tank destroyer, the German defensive line was silent. The trapped squads began their withdrawal from the drainage ditch, moving under covering fire that Murphy continued to adjust from his elevated position. One by one, men who had given up hope began making their way back to American lines, guided by artillery that cleared their path with mathematical precision. Murphy remained on the burning tank destroyer until the last man had reached safety, his position now drawing concentrated fire from German reinforcements moving up from the rear. Only when the final squad had made it to cover did he climb down from the M36 and begin his own walk back across the open ground, this time moving through a landscape that his own fire missions had transformed from enemy stronghold to silent testimony of what one man could accomplish when dying was acceptable but failing was not. The walk back felt longer than the walk out, though Murphy covered the same 60 yards of frozen ground at the same unhurried pace. German artillery had begun falling behind him, not the random harassment fire of the morning, but concentrated salvos aimed at the tank destroyer that had cost them their carefully prepared positions. The shells arrived just as Murphy reached the American foxholes, close enough that the concussion knocked him to his knees in the snow. Kowalski hauled him into the command post, checking for wounds with the automatic concern of men who'd learned to evaluate damage quickly. Murphy was uninjured, but his hands were shaking. Not from cold or fear, but from something deeper that would take hours to surface fully. "All squads accounted for," Jackson reported, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who'd just witnessed something he couldn't quite categorize. 24 effectives returned. 2 KIA we couldn't recover. Murphy nodded and reached for the radio handset to file his initial report with battalion. His voice was steady as he provided the tactical details. Enemy positions destroyed, friendly casualties, ammunition expended. But the words felt hollow compared to the weight of what had actually happened on that burning tank destroyer. What the after-action report wouldn't capture was the moment when Murphy had looked down his rifle sights at a German machine gunner and saw a young man not much older than himself. Someone who might have been walking behind a plow instead of crouching behind a machine gun if history had drawn different lines across their lives. The artillery strike that silenced that position had been tactically necessary and morally justified, but it still felt like carrying stones in his chest. The report also wouldn't mention the private conversation Murphy had been having with God while rifle bullets sparked around him. Not prayers for his own survival. Those had stopped mattering somewhere between Sicily and the Vosges Mountains, but questions about why he kept walking away from situations that killed better men. The radio static had been easier to understand than any answer he'd received. 3 hours later, when the company had established defensive positions in the captured village of Holzwihr, Murphy found himself sitting alone in what had been someone's kitchen before artillery turned it into another military convenience. He was cleaning his carbine with the methodical attention that combat veterans used to process experiences their minds couldn't quite file away. Corporal Jackson found him there, nursing a cup of coffee that was mostly grounds and wishful thinking. Jackson had been drafted from an insurance office in Cleveland, old enough to recognize courage when he saw it, but experienced enough to know that what Murphy had done transcended normal definitions. "Sir, the men are asking questions," Jackson said carefully. "About what happens next time we get in a spot like this, whether you'll—" He trailed off, unable to finish the question that every man in the company was thinking. Murphy understood the unspoken fear. His actions had set a precedent that couldn't be repeated by ordinary soldiers, but would be expected anyway. The next time Company B faced impossible odds, someone would remember the day their lieutenant walked across a killing field and turned defeat into victory through pure, stubborn courage. How do you follow that example without getting everyone killed? "Next time will be different," Murphy said finally, his Texas drawl carrying undertones that Jackson couldn't quite interpret. "Every situation is different. You do what the ground tells you, not what worked before." It was the right answer for a young corporal worried about his men, but it didn't address Murphy's private understanding that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. 24 men had walked away from that drainage ditch because he'd been willing to accept odds that no reasonable person would take. The weight of their survival was now permanently attached to his name. Another addition to a collection that was getting too heavy to carry. The citation arrived 3 weeks later, processed through channels that transformed Murphy's walk across the killing field into clean paragraphs suitable for official records. The language was precise and appropriately heroic, conspicuous gallantry, devotion to duty, complete disregard for personal safety. Reading it was like looking at a photograph of someone who happened to share his name. Sergeant Kowalski read the citation aloud to the squad during mail call, his Brooklyn accent making the formal military prose sound almost satirical. The men listened with the polite attention reserved for official ceremonies, but Murphy noticed that none of them quite met his eyes afterward. The award had created a distance that hadn't existed when he was just another rifleman who happened to survive longer than most. Company B spent the rest of January fighting through the Vosges Mountains, each engagement adding new layers to the legend that was accumulating around Murphy's name. Stories spread through the regiment with the kind of embellishment that turned tactical actions into folklore. By the time they reached division headquarters, Murphy's 20 minutes on the tank destroyer had become an hour-long single-handed assault against an entire German company. Murphy learned to smile and nod when staff officers asked about his secret for surviving impossible situations. The real answer, that he'd stopped believing he would survive long enough for it to matter, wasn't the kind of thing you said to colonels looking for inspiration to pass down to their men. The comfortable lies were easier for everyone involved. The nightmares started in February, though Murphy didn't call them that. They were just moments when the smell of diesel exhaust or the sound of radio static would transport him back to that burning tank destroyer, feeling the heat of the deck through his boots and hearing the intimate whisper of bullets meant specifically for him. During these episodes, he could taste the metal flavor of absolute fear mixed with the strange peace that came from accepting death as inevitable. Years later, when Murphy was being interviewed for a magazine article about Medal of Honor recipients, the reporter asked him what he thought about during those 20 minutes under fire. Murphy had been expecting the question for a decade, but he still didn't have an answer that would satisfy anyone looking for inspirational quotes. What he remembered most clearly wasn't the tactical situation or the artillery coordinates, but the faces of the men he was trying to save. Young faces mostly, belonging to soldiers who'd written letters home that morning and expected to write more letters tomorrow. The weight of their trust had been heavier than enemy fire and more frightening than any German artillery barrage. The reporter wanted to know if Murphy ever regretted his decision to cross that open ground. It was the kind of question that assumed heroism was a choice between clearly marked alternatives, rather than the result of finding yourself in a situation where every option led through territory that would change you forever. Murphy's answer was diplomatic and appropriately modest, but privately he understood that regret was beside the point. He'd done what the ground required, what his men needed, what the moment demanded. The consequences, the medals, the legend, the weight of impossible expectations were just the price of walking away alive when better men hadn't. Sometimes, on quiet evenings in Texas, Murphy would sit on his porch and listen to the wind move through the cotton fields. In those moments, the distance between the farm boy and the legend felt manageable. The war was over, his men had made it home, and the frozen hell of the Vosges Mountains was just another collection of memories that could be filed away until someone asked the right questions. But then a car would backfire, or thunder would roll across the plains, and suddenly he was 20 years old again, standing on a burning tank destroyer while history took notes for its own purposes. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.